Hello, this is People of Substance by LemonSkies. I'm Olga, and my guest today is Henri Makembe. Am I totally butchering how I pronounce your name?
100%, but it's okay. Henri Makembe.
Okay, correct me.
Makembe.
Makembe. I want to make sure that I get it right. So thank you for agreeing to be here. Henri is the CEO of Do Big Things. And I just want to give you a chance to introduce yourself, describe Do Big Things and what the organization does.
Of course. Well, thank you, Olga, for having me. Very excited to be here. I am Henri Makembe, CEO of Do Big Things, and Do Big Things is a progressive communication shop, and we work with progressive candidates, foundations, an advocacy organization to really use technology to help them tell their story to move people to action, right? And we are about 50% people of color, right? And we're a remote company based everywhere. So I've been personally in the advocacy space for about 2 decades since I had hair. Now I no longer have hair, so that's how long. That's the stress that gets to you. But yeah, and that's a little bit about me.
When we talked privately, you said it was your children that caused the hair loss.
Look, it's stress. So maybe a little bit of each.
So Henri, I'm going to jump right in here. You've been in, let's call it nonprofit adjacent space your entire career. So not necessarily, some of it may have been nonprofits, but organizations, companies that in some capacity support nonprofit and mission-driven causes. So I wanted to ask you, was that by design kind of direction you always wanted to go in, or was some of it just circumstantial that landed you here?
Can I say both? I think from my perspective, I think I was always interested in politics, right? And I think that's something that I've always been interested in since immigrating to America. However, coming out of college, I couldn't work in a nonprofit organization or the Hill because of the financial implications of that, right? Didn't have a safety net to go on. So then I started becoming a developer and really focus on kind of my technical skills, right? And in about 2005 or so, folks started realizing that you can use the internet, right, in advocacy world, and that has allowed me to kind of make a pivot, right? So I've always wanted to do it, but I ended up in it accidentally because finally people saw the need for technology in advocacy and movement building.
Yeah. So you alluded to immigrating to the United States, and that's something you and I share, and we've talked about it in the past. So I wanted to ask you, being an immigrant, first generation, how has it shaped your view of the world? How does it shape the way you present yourself to the outer world? What has that experience and what has your story been like?
Yeah, I think it's very much who I am to this day, right? I think I always, in my work and how I approach things, I always bring a global perspective to it, even when working on local issues. Like, right, I always try to think about, you know, what's going on in other places and how that shapes the advice or the advocacy that I give my clients. And then I am much more open to learning about what's going on elsewhere. Are there things that folks working in U.S. politics on U.S. movement building can learn from places like Russia, India, Argentina, even in Africa, like, right? And so that immigrant mindset allow me to always kind of have a global perspective to the work that I do. And I think it also allows me to appreciate some things about American democracy, right? I think oftentimes it feels like a lot of our institutions and a lot of what we're doing here is going down the drain. But I'm also, when I also look at the global map, I still feel like we're in a good place, right? It doesn't mean that we don't fight to preserve what we've built here, but it also doesn't mean everything is a dumpster fire, right? And there is a much more nuanced view of what's going on.
That makes sense. So I don't know if you've had similar experience, but growing up, learning English as my second language, I always felt very self-conscious. And then, at some point I sort of stopped being self-conscious because I realized that, once you get past the jokes about me being like a Bond spy or something like that, I just sort of realized, well, I speak a whole another language that most people don't. Has that been your experience?
Well, it's funny. I lost my French accent because I was trying to fit in, right? So
Mhm.
maybe the jokes got to me a little bit more than they got to you. um, so from that perspective, it did impact me, as in, most of the time you can't tell that I am fluent in French, right? But when I do some thinking, sometimes I actually get stuck thinking in French, and I can't come up with the English words, which is hilarious, I think, to most folks. But it did happen to me, and I did work very hard to lose my French accent.
Do you ever speak one language and then turn and keep speaking the same language, even though you should switch to a different one? Has that ever happened to you? It's the most,
Yes,
yes, that's
yes,
mind-boggling, right?
yes. I think the most difficult one is when I am walking and
Hmm.
speaking in one language,
Hmm.
and a conversation happens by me in the other language that I also
Hmm.
understand, and like I cannot stop myself from listening and switching languages in my head, and that's very difficult.
Yeah, it's bizarre because you almost have to be like, wait, what language am I listening to? Like you understand it, but
Yes,
yeah.
it's like a half a second of like readjusting your head, be like, no,
Mhm.
I'm supposed to be speaking this language.
I'm glad to hear that it's not just me. You mentioned building a movement. So, I mean, first and foremost, what trends are you seeing in movements, and what does it take to build a movement?
That's a very good question. I think the trend I'm seeing in movement is the localization of
Mm.
movements, right? I think we've gone through a period where everything had to be really massive and really national, right? And I think a lot of folks who are organizing these days are really appreciating how do you organize locally, right? Talk to folks on the ground and keep kind of the change and the impact that you're trying to create. Locally, and then adding up those local wins to a massive broader movement, right? And I think we're seeing that in the climate space, where folks are organizing at the city level for their solar power and the solar panels and those type of things. And we're seeing that around criminal justice and police reform, right? Really focusing on like, how is my city handling the training of police, the reforming of the police, and the resources allocation there, right? And I think that is a trend that I'm seeing all across the board. The question is, and something for us to look at is, are those movements sustainable, um,
Mhm.
going on, and if so, for how long, right? And but that is a trend that I'm seeing in my work.
I was reading recently about a resurgence of local news outlets because obviously with internet and just various reasons, a lot of newspapers and a lot of local news outlets have shut down. But just sort of the call for that and the need for that. So that's interesting that you bring up localization. So,
Yeah, and I think having a good kind of media landscape helps up create a space for people to have those discussions with the policymakers at the local level, right? We work with INN, which is, I think, the Institute of Nonprofit News, who kind of support local papers, and it's been fascinating kind of doing that work with them and seeing exactly what you're talking about there, which is like the growth of local journalism. Even in a difficult period for now. So people are thinking of different models and how to support journalism at the local level, because it is important, right, to make
yeah.
sure folks are aware what their policymakers are doing.
Well, what they're doing, and also kind of the relevancy, right? Because I may not really care all that much about very hyper local issues that are, a few counties away, but if it impacts me very immediately, and the people, and the streets, it kind of gets you paying attention.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
I only invite people who agree with me. No,
Fair enough. Fair enough. It is your show.
Um, so, Henry, what is the difference between a movement that just sort of blows up and becomes truly a movement versus something that fizzles out? That's something I was kind of wondering about and thinking about. Some things have really taken. The one that comes to mind for me, for some reason, is Me Too movement. I mean, it's
Mhm.
really become, there are multiple news related things that really kind of made it the very big thing. But there's been other initiatives or other things you hear on the news that just sort of have a very quick spurt, really quick moment, and then just sort of peter out really quickly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hesitate to define the word movement in a particular kind of way, right? Because I think what matters is, did it have impact and did it move the conversation? A movement does not need to be around for 10, 20 years to be impactful, right? See the Arab Spring, right? Whereas there are other movements that need to be sustained to change society completely, right? So we should be looking at movements, whether they are longstanding or temporary or short, or for a better word, as did it have the desired impact,
Yeah.
right? And if we look at it from that perspective, I think we'll find that some of the movements that quote unquote have died down actually accomplished their goals, whereas some of the movements that are ongoing have not, right? And so using time as a parameter for success is not something that I feel comfortable with. I'm sure other people will present different values argument, but I think time should not be the judge of success, because the longer a movement goes on, the more likely you have the 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 chances of institutions becoming self-serving, right? And there's no greater example of that around the world except for like the ANC in South Africa, right? The movement to free Black people there's still tons of work to be done. And anybody who studies South African history recognizes, reveres, and appreciates what the ANC has done for the South African Blacks. And I would say Blacks as a whole in Africa, but no one who's being honest with themselves right now looks at the ANC and says that is the future of South Africa, right? So is there a case that to be made that the ANC went from being a movement to becoming an institution, right? And has stayed that way and has continued to build power. But is that a good thing?
Right.
Is that serving Black South African today?
I love that definition. I actually wrote it down where you just said, did it move the conversation? So sometimes it's achieving very tangible goals, right? Like, South Africa, and, there were very concrete results coming out of it, but moving the conversation and awareness. I love that definition because it sort of forces you to think a little bit more longer term. Did it just move the needle a little bit to get closer to a particular goal?
Yeah. I mean, we look at what's happening in Flint, Michigan, right? For a while, and the water situation there, for a while, it was on the news every day, right? And it's no longer on the news every day, but there does continue to be work being done in Flint for that, right? Being on the TV long enough to bring attention to the plight of folks in Flint, Michigan, right? And turning our collective attention to that was great. But the fact of the matter is, most of us outside Flint, Michigan cannot do much about that, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, but now do the people on the ground feel like they've created enough attention and gathered enough purposes to continue reforming how, Flint is working, and the issues and the water issues and who's impacted by those water issues, right? It doesn't mean the work is done. It doesn't mean it stopped, but like, would it being on CNN every day continue to do that work? No. There's a case to be made for yes, there's a case to be made for no. But I think, from my perspective, it didn't fizzle out. It was successful at what it was supposed to do, which is create attention so that change and work can begin in Flint, Michigan and continue to be sustained.
Well, and there's also this media cycle that's ever accelerating where, I was thinking back in February, March, Ukraine was on the news 24/7, and, the war very much continues, but we're not seeing it in the news headlines as much. It's sort of like it's not page one news anymore because of many, many other things that have happened. And so that's interesting. I want to talk to you about importance of hiring companies that in leadership or in ownership or in their roots have a diverse base, whether it's ethnic and racial diversity, whether it's gender, any number of other factors. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think I happen to agree, but how does one go about seeking out companies that that really do have kind of wider and broader roots?
Yeah, I think there's two things to that question. So I'm going to take one and two. Why is it important to hire a
Mhm.
diverse company? I think it is important to hire a diverse company because in an age of storytelling, I think having a different perspective through the folks creating the story that you're trying to tell
Mhm.
or helping tell you that story um, allows you to tell a more authentic and a better story that will resonate with more people, right? So that is very important, right? And I think when you're working with folks who, like, I'm an immigrant. So if I'm working with an immigrant group, I bring a different perspective than different immigrants do. And so having that story there helps me, having experienced myself helps them tell a better story, right? I'm a black man in America.
Mhm.
So I've experienced situations with the police that is not pleasant. So when I see an ads that has young black men, smoking marijuana or have that implication, I do a double take. I'm like, this doesn't
Mhm.
feel right, right? And so I think that's important. And same thing for having not just, I think, people of color, but people that don't typically fit in the traditional workplace. So, like single mothers or part time workers or physically disabled workers or any type of those, they help you tell a better story so it resonate more authentically with those segment of the population, right? Because it's like, I can see myself there, right?
Mhm.
So that's one aspect of it. The second part of your question was how do you go about finding these firms and working with them? I think that requires a lot of work from the folks doing the hiring. And I think it requires creating systems that are actually navigable and understanding of what folks are. What do I mean for that? A number of organizations, especially the big ones, have put quotas into like hiring minority vendors,
Yeah.
right? And those vendors have to be certified. But the hardship to become a certified minority vendor prevents most minority owned businesses to become certified, right? So it's kind of like, yes, you want these folks, but the way to hire them is actually blocked, right? And so how do you deal with that, right? Because even for us, we're just going through our, 4 years in being a successful business, having run some of the biggest races in America, including a presidential. We're just getting around to being like, oh, we should actually be a certified minority owned business, right? And we're about 30 folks, right? And we're finally getting to it. So I can't imagine smaller folks
Yeah.
having the time to be able to do that, right?
Yeah.
So folks who are committed to hiring minority firms should really think about, do we have the right processes in place to vet these firms, right? They should be having conversation much before an RFI or an RFP comes out to kind of understand what those folks are. And then they should look at their internal processes and say, what are the requirements that we're putting in place for folks to qualify to even apply for these
Mhm.
kind of RFPs? And I think a lot of organizations have good intent, but
Yeah.
have not taken a step back and analyzed their processes and what they're asking of folks to make sure that they've opened the gate as wide as possible for people to participate. Did I cover that?
Yeah, I think so. I've been kind of struggling with, everyone seems to have a statement, but how do you delineate having a statement on your website about diversity and inclusion from actually being diverse and inclusive, right? So I think that's the question I grapple with.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks could start by reporting it. If you're a big agency or if you're a big organization, why don't you start reporting, what how much money you're spending with your vendors? That is a very good way of saying, actually, we're meeting the statement that we put out or we're not, and work towards getting better every year,
Yeah.
right? I think once you have the numbers in front of you, you can decide how to allocate resources internally to help you do better next year.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Henry, are you ready to have fun? We
Yes.
covered a lot of subjects from South Africa to Flint, Michigan to diversity. I mean, this was a very fittingly substantive conversation. But now I wanted to play a round of Two Truth and a Lie. And
Okay.
you told me that you've never played before. So the way it
Never.
works, you tell me two things that are true, And one thing that's a lie, just a tip, whenever you add more detail, that tends to kind of really trick people into thinking it's true. Not
Okay.
always the case. So that's just a tip, best practice for the game. And then I have to guess it. And I know you, but I don't know you that well. So this will be a fun challenge for me. And I can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Okay. 2 truths and a lie. All right. I got this. I once visited 5 stadiums in London in a span of 48 hours.
Okay.
Okay.
Mhm.
I once met Barack Obama in North Carolina during his presidential run.
Mhm.
I had amazing cookies at, let me rephrase that. I had amazing cookies in South Carolina at at one of the Republicans' candidates' after parties.
So I'm going to say that stadium is true because I know you're a big soccer fan, soccer player, etc. So I definitely believe that. And I don't remember all the names, but I know within vicinity of London, there's plenty of stadiums. So I'm going to say that's true. So I'm debating. So on one hand, I feel like the North Carolina, you probably have met Barack Obama, but maybe it wasn't North Carolina. On the other hand, I sort of question you entering a Republican event related. So I'm going to say that that last one was a lie. There were no cookies.
That one was the truth. How
That
come
was the truth.
party has amazing cookies?
What were the cookies?
I forget. It was Mike Huckabee's party. I just remember because it was Mike Huckabee's party, and we went to all the Republican presidential candidates after parties during the South Carolina. So that one was actually true. I did not meet Barack Obama in North Carolina. I actually think it was South Carolina, but yeah.
So it was just a different state.
Yeah.
Very sneaky. Very sneaky.
Yeah, different state.
Well, this was so much fun to have you on. So thank you for coming. I hope, in a few months' time, we can chat again and kind of keep having these conversations. So thank you for being here, Henry.
Olga, thank you so much for having me. I had fun and I learned in your game. I'm going to have to use that sometimes.
That game can get very dirty very quickly. Just heads up. So be careful who you play with.
Thank you for that. I will keep it out of the workplace then.
Thank you.